surprised, just like I was. You know, you get involved in the work and time flies by, and then you're on to the next thing, and you sort of forget about that list of things that, you know, you had done throughout the year, and you look back and you think, wow. But that was the most common comment after I played that slideshow. Folks came up to me and they said, you know, we forgot all about that thing that happened, or we forgot all about that thing that we did, because sometimes our lives get really, really busy. And I thought that this evening, I would kind of speak to that topic because we are maybe a week late, kind of into the summer, into that busy part of our lives. That and the fact that tomorrow I leave for vacation. And this is one of the few sermons well, I shouldn't say that because that's going to sound real bad. But it's one of the few sermons that I actually get to walk away from and immediately demonstrate that it is the case, right? Tonight we're going to talk a little bit about the Sabbath. And we're going to talk about the idea of Christians, the work that we do, and the fact that we need to take breaks. Yeah, we can remember that in the course of our summer activities. And of course, some of you are thinking ahead like, I don't know when that's going to happen. You know, especially, folks, Melissa and Sarah, you're going to leave the country and get into that other land. And, you know, it's probably going to be nonstop for what, 3+ weeks? Yeah, so when's that break going to come? Well, it'll come, and you just got to make sure that, we have time to take it. But let's go ahead and turn back into the Old Testament, to the book of Exodus. The book of Exodus, chapter 23, beginning with verse 10. Exodus 23, beginning with verse 10. Of course, Moses is the writer. Moses says, "For 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its yield. But the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, that the poor of your people may eat, and what they leave the beasts of the field may eat. And you shall do likewise with your vineyard and with your olive orchard. 6 days shall you do no work, but on the 7th day you shall rest, that your ox and your donkey may have rest, and the son of your servant woman and the alien may be refreshed." Now, you may recall that in the Ten Commandments, back in Exodus chapter 20, there is the command kind of sandwiched in there between all of the thou shalt nots. This command for them to remember the Sabbath and to keep it holy. So what is this whole Sabbath thing? Well, the Sabbath is kind of predated by creation, right? You remember God created the whole of existence as we know it in 6 days, and on the 7th day he rested. On the 7th day he rested. And then everything that he builds kind of into man, and everything that he builds as far as his system of coming to the knowledge of spiritual things, has this sort of built-in rest, this idea that, it's not all work. It's not all labor. It's not all toil. It's not all supposed to be this kind of, elbow grease, nose to the grindstone sort of attitude. But there has to be a time for rest. Well, why? Well, because since creation, it was so. I mean, did you ever buy anything for a certain purpose and it never worked for that purpose? I don't know about you, but I have. There are VCRs and DVD players that made better doorstops in my house than actually for playing DVDs. They're better, well, you name it. Sometimes things just don't work for the purpose for which they were intended. Well, what's wrong? Well, you're created for a certain way. You're created in a certain way, and you're supposed to work that way. For us to kind of not involve rest as part of our life and our daily living is to kind of look squarely in the face of creation and tell God, you know what? I know better. I know better than you do. Even though from the very beginning of things you have said, 6 days on, 1 day off. I know better. And that's just the way it has to be. Well, there's wisdom here. Now, I know you turn over to the book of Colossians, you turn over to the New Testament, and you can count the number of passages, and they are indeed abundant, that tells us that the old law has passed away. The old law has passed away. It has been nailed to the cross. Turn over to Colossians real quick, chapter 2, verse 16. Colossians chapter 2, let's read verses 16 and 17. He says, "Therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival, or a new moon, or a Sabbath. These are a shadow of things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. In other words, Christ fulfilled all of these Old Testament principles and precepts. Christ is the fulfillment of all of the sacrificial system. You remember all of the sacrifices that they had to make? You remember all of the hoops that they kind of had to jump through in the whole ceremonial aspect of the law? Well, Christ came along and he fulfilled the law. He fulfilled the law. He was the substance of the law. So as far as a technical celebration of some Sabbath goes, that is no longer part of who we are as a body of believers. That's part of that old covenant. That's part of the old law. And yet that does not mean that there isn't wisdom there. Because though Christ fulfilled it, it is still the shadow of things to come. In other words, it foreshadowed it, which tells us that there has to be wisdom within those words. And God builds in that wisdom. God builds in that wisdom, and he makes it very, very clear to us that this is the way it should work. Just look at the ministry of Christ as he came to this world. How many times does the Bible tell us that, and he left his disciples and he left the multitudes and he went to the top of the mount to pray alone. Well, there are times when he disappears for several days and does that. And he goes and he's alone. Sometimes he says he goes into the wilderness. Now, wilderness is not perhaps what we have sort of in our mind, like, kind of a jungle that's overgrown and we got to get out the machete and kind of cut our way through, and it's rocky and dangerous and all that. Wilderness in the Bible typically just means a place that's uninhabited. Nobody lives there. I mean, it could be desert, it could be whatever, but it's just a place where nobody lives. Christ regularly went there. Even within his ministry, he would pull back from the multitudes and he would take refuge outside of Jerusalem in the little town of, anybody remember the name? It's the name of my daughter. Bethany. Bethany. And whose house did he stay in? Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, right? Didn't know it was quiz night. Okay, that's okay. You get a break from that next week. All right, but he stayed with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, and he was in their home. Got a break from the crowds, got a break from all the things that he did. So during the ministry of Christ, this was one of those constant things that was part of who he was. Sometimes you just have to say, give me a break. I've got to take a break. And there's wisdom in it. And if we go back and we look at the words in the Old Testament, and we go back and we look at the idea, there are several implications to God building this, quote, Sabbath, or as we would call it, rest, into our life. Before we get to those implications, I want to mention just one other thing. When we go to Paul's writing, I believe, in the book of Hebrews, Paul says that, there is a rest that remains today, and you ought to be careful how you walk so that you don't miss that rest. And he goes back and he recounts the life of Joshua. He recounts the life of Joshua and how he led the children of Israel into that promised rest, and then concludes by saying, and a rest remains. Now that's why when we talk about, heaven, we talk about it as rest. So there is a rest in that sense that is future to us, that refers to the idea of heaven. And there's no tears, no sorrow, no work, no pain, none of those things. Those things all go away, and we get a rest from them. We have an easing, from them. But that's not the only rest that the Bible talks about. It does talk about a rest for us while we are in this form. And because it does, it implies certain things about God. The first thing that it implies about God is number one, he loves and cares for human beings. God loves us, and it's indicated to us because of the Sabbath. Now, the whole idea of the Sabbath is an idea that was present in let me see if I can word this correctly. It was present in other cultures in different terms. In other words, this whole day of rest thing was something that would have existed in ancient times as well among the, quote, other deities. You see, the pagan gods of, say, the Babylonians, they had their day of rest too. But the thing that made this rest different, the thing that made the Sabbath different than, say, the Dagons and the Baals and the Ashtaroths and all those other gods, was that the day of rest that they talked about was a rest that was created not for the people, but for the gods themselves. If you go back and you look at their stories, and some of them are very, very interesting, and they make for good, fiction, but you go back and you look at their stories, part of the reason why they supposedly created man was so that they could not do the work that they had been doing all along. You see, it's hard work being a god, right? It's hard work being a god, so one day they kind of figure out, if we create these beings to serve us, then, we don't have to do the work, so we can rest. Now, that sounds kind of petty, and you and I know that, that's kind of mythology. Well, not kind of, it's mythology. It's just superstitious belief. But that's what a lot of people in these ancient times, believe. But then along comes God, the one true God, and His Sabbath, and He teaches that no, you need a rest. You need to have a rest from your labors, and your field needs to have a rest, and your animals need to have a rest, and the slaves in your home, they need to have a rest. God's love for humanity prompts him to build this into who we are as a people. Now, you can see God's love for us created or from the time of creation, and that He builds in this time when we can refresh, this time when we can spend and recharge. Turn over to Mark, the book of Mark, chapter 2. Mark chapter 2, verse 23. This is one of the many occasions, and I don't know if you ever noticed this or not, but did you ever notice that as you read through the New Testament, and we just kind of finished up the Gospels not too long ago, did you notice when we were reading through the Gospels in our Wednesday night study, how many times and how many confrontations that Christ had with the Pharisees revolved around Him doing something on the Sabbath? You ever notice that? I mean, it's over and over and over. Well, this is one of those occasions. It says, on the Sabbath, He was going through the grain fields. And as they made their way, His disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to Him, look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? And He said to them, have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry? He and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the priest, and he ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. So according to Christ, the Sabbath is still this relevant idea, but more importantly, he says the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. This is not just simply a law that you have to go by, but it was made for man's greatest good. And they had perverted it. They had turned it into some law by which they could punish people. And it was never intended for that. It was intended to be a day of rest, a day of recharge, a day when you could get a break from all of that stuff. And you don't have to go to work. And the boss isn't pushing you. And you're not required to do X, Y, and Z. That was the Sabbath. And he says that Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. He rules over it, telling us that not only is it relevant, but it is bound up in this whole notion that God loves us. I mean, for what purpose did Christ come? Well, He came to sacrifice Himself, for us. if he is Lord of the Sabbath, and the Lord of the Sabbath is offering himself, then what does that say about the object of that offering? And the reason for that offering, maybe it's a better way to put it. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. The Sabbath speaks to the love that God has for us. I've told the story before about the two guys who were, cutting down trees. Two guys are cutting down trees, both getting paid the same rate per tree, right? And one guy just labors and labors and labors and toils, and he's sore, and by the time noon day comes along, he's just so exhausted he almost can't go on. But he pushes through. He wants to make it a good day. And his buddy over here, he cuts down a tree and stops, takes a break. Cuts down a tree, stops and takes a break. Cuts down a tree and stops and takes a break. And at the end of the day, the guy who stopped and took the breaks cut down twice as many trees as the guy who went at it and never stopped. And he goes to the other fellow and he says, how did you do it? How is it possible that you cut down more trees than I did? You took breaks after every single tree. And of course, you guys know the answer, right? Between every single tree, I stopped to sharpen my blade. And that's exactly what the Sabbath, what the idea of the Sabbath does for us. I mean, imagine you're an Israelite and you own a field. You own a field, and God tells you every 6th year you have to leave that field. Let it lie dormant. Don't plant anything on it. Now, the tendency is probably to think this: well, if I don't plant that field, then I don't get a crop. If I don't get a crop, man, what am I going to sell? How am I going to support myself? Where's that money going to come from? And how am I going to feed my family? And man, we were really saving up for this or that, or bring it into modern times. And what's important to us? And what are we going to not have because we're not planting that field? But he decides, you know what? I'm going to do what God says. I'm going to let that field lie dormant. And he watches it. He watches the weeds grow up. He watches the rains fall. He watches the animals come in and partake of the vegetation, and all is there. And you know what? Somehow he makes it. Somehow the poverty that he was expecting to come never seems to come. And the next year he plants his crop. And not only does he get a crop out of it, but he gets a bumper crop. Because God tells him, if you take a rest, then you will be blessed. Kind of rhymes, right? And that's the way it is in our life. Man, we're tempted to work. If I just do more. But if I slack off here, and that's what we call it. We slack off. Man, slacking off is not the same thing as taking a rest. It's not the same thing at all. We kind of mix these things up in our mind. If we're supposed to be doing something, and then we should be doing it to the best of our ability, and we should do it from end to finish. But when we're finished, what do? Do we just jump on to the next thing, or do we stop and take some time to recharge ourselves? Whatever you find to do with your hands, do it with all your might, right? So when you're in the midst of the task, you ought to do it. I tell my kids all the time, if it's worth doing, then it's worth doing right. And it's worth doing well. So, if you're going to do it correct. But that doesn't mean that when we're done with that, we got to move right on to the next thing. Saying to ourselves, well, if I'm not doing this, if I'm not productive, then I somehow I'm not equal with, somebody else, or I'm not being spiritual, or some other thing. Sometimes we need to, sometimes the greatest lesson that we can learn is, how to relax, how to take it easy, and how to truly recharge. I think, and I'm ever convinced that we are in a society where there is an ever-growing need for people to just simply learn how to let go of things and how to relax. Look at the people around you every day. How many uptight people are there? I've never heard so much especially in the last 5 to 10 years, about stress. About stress and how stress is like one of the biggest problems that people have, to the point where it's causing folks physical issues. And maybe it's because we just don't stop and take time to let some of those things go, to find a way to meditate. But it's not that easy. We have this little thing. It's funny. It's a little, well, on the outside it looks like an iPod, but on the outside of it says the Stress Cure. And you just plug a set of headphones in, and it's a guy, and he talks. And there's a lesson on this thing. And the lesson begins by saying this. Today I want to teach you how to meditate by teaching you how to not meditate. Okay, I spent money for this, really? But as the lesson goes on, the guy begins to make sense. He says, you ever lie in bed and not be able to sleep? So you sit there and think about sleeping, and because you're thinking about sleeping, you can't fall asleep. And because you can't fall asleep, you think about, man, I would like to sleep more. And because you think more about it, then you can't fall asleep. And he says, relaxing is kind of the same way. We have to kind of talk ourselves into it at times by becoming objective in our thought process. And he goes through a series of steps on how to do that. But there's an ever-growing need for things like that in our society, when it requires us to move at this fast pace. And I think that one of the things that we need to remember is that God, in all his love for you, not only gave you his Son to die on a cross, but he also said, hey, take a break. Take a rest. Second implication, the Sabbath reveals to us God's design in creation. People, animals, and land require rest in order to thrive. That's life. That's life. Anybody ever go 24 hours without sleeping? All right, I'll tell you what, let's start at 36. How many people at 36 hours without sleeping? Okay, 24? Yeah, okay, so we can work our way backwards from there, but you've ever been sleep deprived, it can be a very difficult thing. It's a very difficult thing. Do you function well when you haven't slept for 36 hours? Do you function well when you get beyond that, 48 hours maybe? And maybe some of you have gone even longer than that. How well do you think? What's your attitude like? Are you happy-go-lucky? Well, maybe you are. Maybe you're one of those, I get real tired and I get real silly kind of people, and you're just as useless then as you are if you're grumpy, right? We don't think well because by creation we're not designed to go without rest. Physically, mentally, across the board. We're supposed to take a rest. Number three, the Sabbath reveals to us that humans are made in the image of God. I don't know if you've ever thought about that before. We're told that back in the book of Genesis, let us make man in our image. Let's make man in our image. Well, what does that mean? Well, I think for the most part it means that we are spiritual creatures. That we are, fashioned with this spiritual nature. And we have ingrained within us those things that are at the core of who God is. God is light, and God is love, and God is all of these things. And when he made us, he built those things into who we are. But by the same token, God created for 6 days, and he rested on the seventh. And that's just as much a part of us as anything else about God. Number 4, the Sabbath reveals the need for human limits. People have a tendency to overwork themselves. Okay? Anybody in here that you could look at and you could say that person is a workaholic? Anybody in your family, is a workaholic? Anybody of you need a mirror to identify the workaholic? Yeah, most of us know people, who are like that. And sometimes, we applaud that. And for the most part, it is a good thing. It is a good thing. But everybody needs a rest. Because we as human beings have limits. We have limits. And this kind of reminds us of that. Just kind of limits in general. God tells us within the Sabbath, or implies within the Sabbath, that, you're not self-sufficient. Your power is not all-encompassing. You do have limitations to your abilities. And kind of the roundabout message there, it may seem like an odd tie-in, is you need me. You need me. The Sabbath also reveals to us the human need for discipline and structure. Discipline and structure. Sometimes we have to work so hard because we messed up so bad, right? Sometimes we're just simply unorganized. Unorganized, can't seem to get it together, and we have to work twice as hard to do half the work that the folks over here who are organized and have structure seem to do. Why? Because there's a tendency for us to simply not be self-disciplined. You move over into the New Testament and you find Paul and the others talking about this time and time again. The fruits of the Spirit. What's the last one? Anybody know? See, if I'd asked you the third one, you probably would have. Self-control. Self-control. Well, what does that mean, self-control? Well, it's what we're talking about here. Self-discipline. Self-discipline. That same self-discipline that keeps you on task should be applied to getting you off task and to taking a break. If we have self-discipline all along the way, then this rest that God has built for us, that He recommends for us, is something that is a benefit to us. And the final thing, and then I'll give it a rest, is this. The Sabbath reveals the human tendency to marginalize God. When we know that we should be taking a rest, and we know that God recommends the rest, and yet we continue to work through it, to not heed His call. What does that say to God? When God says, hey, you got to slow it down. You got to take a break. You got to take time to, as we would say, stop and smell the roses, so to speak. And we say, no, God, we know better. Isn't that really us marginalizing God and who He is? Isn't it as if we're saying, we understand more than you do. We know more about this life than you do. When we honor God and we seek His will, and I know it probably seems like a small thing, but if we are truly seeking His will in all things, then I think we're going to find a time to take a rest, to give ourselves a break so that we can reflect on our attitudes, so that we can reflect on our life and its work and all that we're trying to accomplish for Him and by Him. Erma Bombeck, anybody not know the name? Wrote this piece that I want to read for you just before she lost her battle with cancer. She says, if I had my life to live over, I would have talked less and listened more. I would have invited friends over to dinner, even if the carpet was stained and the sofa faded. I would have eaten the popcorn in the good living room and worried much less about the dirt when someone wanted to light a fire in the fireplace. I would have taken the time to listen to my grandfather ramble about his youth. I would never have insisted that the car windows be rolled up on a summer day because my hair had just been teased and sprayed. I would have burned the pink candle sculpted like a rose before it melted in storage. I would have sat on the lawn with my children and not worried about the grass stains. I would have cried and laughed less. I would have cried and laughed less while watching TV and more while watching life. I would have shared more of the responsibility carried by my husband. I would have gone to bed when I was sick instead of pretending that the earth would go into a holding pattern if I weren't there for the day. I would never have bought anything just because it was practical, wouldn't show soil, or was guaranteed to last a lifetime. Instead of wishing away 9 months of pregnancy, I would have cherished every moment and realized that the wonderment growing inside of me was the only chance in life to assist God in a miracle. When my kids kissed me impetuously, I would never have said later, "Now go get washed up for dinner." There would have been more "I love yous," more "I'm sorries," but mostly, given another shot at life, I would seize every minute, look at it and really see it, live it, and never give it back. Now, it shouldn't take some disease for us to come to grips with that reality, because it's all over God's Word. It's part of His fingerprints that He leaves on our lives and in our souls. It's the pattern that He has established for us. So, as we enter into this busy time of year, hopefully, in the recesses of our minds, we will somehow make time and then live that break that we know that God encourages us to take. Because we know that when we do here and we're recharged, that's when we do our greatest work. And it's that work that leads us to that eventual rest, where we are with Him for eternity, if we are His children. Now tonight, maybe you're not a child of God. Maybe tonight, your greatest need is to not take a rest, but instead feel that restlessness that inhabits us because we know we are separated from God in the condition in which we live. We know that sin is part of our life, and that ought to make us restless. That ought to make us anxious. Because if we die today in that condition, we would be eternally separated from Him. Maybe you need to heed His words tonight, to enter into the waters of baptism. Have those sins washed clean so you can rise to walk in newness of life. Maybe you have some other need. And maybe it's your desire to make that need known tonight, whether it be prayers, whether it be confession of some fault, whether it be publicly or privately. Don't leave without getting it off of your chest so you can have rest from that burden. You have the opportunity as together we stand and sing.